Have you ever wondered how it feels to have your truth overshadowed by assumptions, especially when the people around you refuse to listen? Imagine leaving the place you once called home, not out of rebellion or anger, but because staying meant losing yourself piece by piece. Yet, the moment you step away, the story is already written for you, without your voice, without your side. Ungrateful. The word doesn't just hang in the air. It clings to you like a shadow, whispered in hushed tones at first, then echoed openly by relatives, family, friends, even strangers who know nothing of the silent struggles that pushed you away. This label becomes the lens through which every action is judged, every decision questioned, and every attempt at healing dismissed. What if the house you left wasn't just a building, but a prison of expectations, silent emotional battles, and invisible wounds? Behind the polished facade that outsiders admired, there lay years of emotional pressure so heavy it was suffocating. But when you tried to explain, your words were met with disbelief or brushed aside as drama. No one asked why leaving became your only option. No one paused to understand the quiet desperation that builds when the place meant to be your sanctuary becomes the source of your pain. Instead, they saw only a betrayal, a selfish act, a rupture of family loyalty. Have you ever been through this before? The feeling of being misjudged by those who claim to love you, their opinions shaped by appearances rather than truths? It's a loneliness unlike any other. A silence filled with accusations and the coldness of being misunderstood. What you're about to discover might surprise you, shedding light on the complexity of leaving home when leaving is the only way to survive. It's a story not about rebellion, but about resilience. Not about betrayal, but about choosing yourself when no one else will. As the quiet judgment looms and the accusations grow louder, the real narrative remains locked behind closed doors, waiting for the moment it can finally be heard. But what happens when the truth begins to surface, slowly unraveling the image everyone accepted without question? Stay with me until the end, because this journey is far from over, and the next chapter will reveal the profound cost of being believed too late, when the damage has already been done. It's in these moments, when silence has ruled for too long and whispers turn into shouts, that we realize how vital it is to listen. Not just to what's easy or convenient, but to what challenges the stories we thought we knew. Maybe you've been there too. Feeling the weight of being misunderstood, the frustration of truths overlooked, or the courage it takes to speak up when everyone else stays quiet. If this resonates with you in any way, I'd love for you to share your thoughts or experiences down in the comments. What part of this story touched you most? Has there ever been a time when you wish someone had heard you before it was too late? Your voice isn't just important. It's what keeps this conversation alive and growing. And if you find yourself drawn to this kind of deep dive into stories that matter, stories that uncover what lies beneath the surface, go ahead and hit that like button. It might seem small, but every like tells me that you want more of this kind of content, that you're here not just as a viewer but as part of a community seeking understanding and truth. It's your support that helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these messages, who might find comfort or clarity through them. So, if you want to stay connected and follow along as we unravel what's really going on behind those closed doors, consider subscribing. It's a simple way to say, yes, I want to be part of this journey. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that demand attention, and maybe, just maybe, change the way we see each other along the way. Because this story, like so many others, isn't just about what's been said or left unsaid. It's about what happens next, and I'm glad you're here to witness it with me. Behind the well-maintained facade, there was a meticulously crafted performance that few could see through. The house, painted a soft, inviting cream, stood quietly on the corner, its windows gleaming under the afternoon sun, curtains drawn just enough to suggest privacy without inviting suspicion. Inside, the air seemed to hum with a gentle orderliness. Chairs were tucked in neatly, dishes stacked as if waiting for the next meal's gathering. The family portraits hanging in the hallway, smiles frozen in time, told a story of unity and tradition that outsiders never doubted. Neighbors greeted each other with practiced warmth, exchanging pleasantries about the weather or upcoming local events. The rhythm of small talk was familiar and comforting, a soundtrack to the neighborhood's collective sense of normalcy. Those who glanced toward our home saw a picture of stability, the kind of place where children thrived and adults carried themselves with quiet dignity. It was easy to believe that everything was as it appeared because no cracks were visible, no raised voices spilled onto the street, no hurried footsteps betrayed tension behind closed doors. Yet, this image was more than just a surface reflection. It was a carefully maintained narrative. Every interaction, every smile, every casual wave had been woven into a pattern that discouraged curiosity. Praise from relatives echoed this sentiment, reinforcing the idea that the family was bonded by affection and mutual respect. So close-knit, they would say, their voices tinged with admiration. This external validation was a shield not only for the physical space but also for the undercurrents that ran beneath it. It repelled skepticism and silenced questions before they could take root. The assumption that calm equaled safety worked in our favor, but it also trapped us in expectations that were impossible to meet. When someone left, whether physically stepping away or emotionally withdrawing, the blame was almost always placed on that individual. The narrative shifted swiftly. The outlier must have been the troublemaker, the one who disrupted harmony, the source of any unrest. This collective judgment allowed the house to preserve its reputation at the expense of acknowledging the complexities inside. Inside those walls, however, the dynamics were far from simple. Conversations often carried an undercurrent of tension, words chosen as carefully as the curtains that kept prying eyes at bay. There were moments when laughter masked discomfort, and gestures of affection felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Beneath the surface, patterns of control and expectation dictated interactions, creating an environment where silence became a survival tool. Expressing doubts or dissatisfaction wasn't just discouraged. It was dangerous, threatening the delicate balance that kept the exterior intact. The routines that outsiders admired were, in many ways, a form of containment. Family dinners, with their predictable seating arrangements and carefully moderated topics, served to maintain appearances. Politeness was less about genuine connection and more about adhering to an unspoken code. Behind the closed doors, the weight of maintaining this equilibrium pressed heavily on everyone, especially those who felt unseen or unheard within it. The house was more than a home. It was a stage where roles were assigned, and deviation was met with swift correction. This external perception shaped not only how others saw us but also how we saw ourselves. The pressure to conform to the ideal image intensified the sense of isolation for those who struggled beneath the surface. Attempts to reveal cracks in the facade were often met with dismissal or disbelief, reinforcing the idea that the truth was whatever the family projected outwardly. The line between reality and performance blurred, leaving little room for authentic expression. As time passed, the walls seemed to absorb not just sounds but emotions, frustrations, hopes, fears, all locked away behind a mask of respectability. The house, in its quiet steadfastness, became a repository of stories untold and feelings unacknowledged. The weight of maintaining this illusion was heavy, and the cost was paid in silence and invisibility. Yet, even the most carefully maintained illusions begin to wear thin. Moments of hesitation, subtle shifts in behavior, and glances exchanged in the dark hinted at the fractures developing beneath the surface. The facade of stability, while enduring, was not impenetrable. What had long been concealed was slowly edging toward exposure, though the shape it would take remained unclear. Amid this tension, the question lingered: how much longer could the outward appearance hold against the mounting pressure inside? The answers were elusive, tangled in the complex web of loyalty, fear, and unspoken truths that defined the space. The story unfolding within these walls was far from over, and whatever came next would challenge not just the image presented to the world but the very foundation upon which it was built. The decision to leave did not emerge from a single flash of clarity. Instead, it was born from countless quiet moments that accumulated like sediment, each one layering over the last until the weight became unbearable. It wasn't that something abruptly snapped. It was that the space in which I existed slowly constricted, shrinking until every breath felt measured, every movement calculated. The tension was a constant presence, a low hum beneath the surface that never quite faded, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. In the beginning, I convinced myself that staying was a testament to resilience. I told myself that endurance was a virtue, that the cracks in the facade could be mended, that the unspoken grudges and the cold silences were temporary, anomalies in an otherwise stable landscape. But with each passing day, the cracks grew wider, and the silences stretched longer. I learned to navigate the moods, to anticipate the shifts in tone that signaled the approach of conflict, and to tread carefully, choosing words that would not provoke. The art of silence became second nature, a shield against the unpredictable storms. What made it so difficult was the absence of dramatic confrontation. There was no explosive argument, no definitive moment of betrayal or sudden change. Instead, the pressure flowed steadily, like water eroding stone. It was the way I was seen less as a person and more as a fixture, tolerated for convenience rather than embraced for who I was. Each glance that lingered just a little too long, each conversation that skirted around my presence, built a tapestry of isolation that was impossible to ignore. The feeling of being an outsider within my own space was suffocating. I tried to hold on to the fragments of what once was, memories of laughter that felt genuine, moments when the walls seemed less like barriers and more like boundaries meant to protect rather than imprison. But those moments became rare, fleeting, almost like echoes from a distant past. The space that once held promise became a cage, and staying felt less like strength and more like submission. The endurance I had once prized revealed itself as a slow, self-inflicted wound. There was a constant calculation in everything I did. I measured my words before speaking, gauged my tone, and adjusted my expressions to fit the expected narrative. It was exhausting to maintain the facade, to perform in a role that was no longer mine but was demanded by those around me. The authenticity of my presence was sacrificed at the altar of peacekeeping, but peace was elusive. The absence of open conflict did not equate to harmony. Instead, it masked a deeper fracture that only widened with time. This internal battle was invisible to most, hidden beneath a surface that appeared calm. People saw the same face, the same routine, but they didn't see the erosion happening beneath. It was a slow unraveling of self, piece by piece, as the environment exacted its toll. The choice to leave wasn't about giving up. It was about reclaiming something lost, a sense of safety, of respect, of belonging that had been quietly stripped away. The final tipping point was not marked by a grand gesture but by a moment of stillness, a realization that the harm being done was no longer something I could endure without losing more than I was willing to sacrifice. The damage was not just to my spirit but to the very core of who I was. Staying had ceased to be a form of survival and had become a steady decline. As the walls closed in tighter, the space for negotiation disappeared. The unspoken rules became chains, and the absence of conflict did not mean the absence of pain. The decision to leave was less about an external event and more about an internal threshold being crossed, an acknowledgement that the way forward required stepping into the unknown, away from the familiarity of discomfort. The story was far from over, but the chapter one was living in had reached its end, and what came next would demand a new kind of strength entirely. The street outside was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that carries a weight of its own. As I walked away from the house, the cool air bit gently at my skin, and with every step, the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo louder in the emptiness around me. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood that the moment I did, I would risk undoing the fragile resolve that had brought me here. The house behind me shrank into the distance, its silhouette blurred by the fading light, and with it, everything I had known for so long. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled with shadows and unfamiliar streets. I hadn't planned where I was going, nor did I have a clear idea of what awaited me beyond the immediate horizon. What I carried was minimal, a small bag filled with essentials, and a heart heavy with mixed feelings. Relief mingled uneasily with fear, and a strange kind of loneliness settled over me, sharper than I had anticipated. The absence of noise from inside the house contrasted starkly with the turmoil inside my head. As I moved further away, the realization that the story I had been part of was now being told without me sank deeper. The narrative spun by others would no longer have my input, my perspective, or my corrections. I was severed from the ongoing dialogue, a silent figure excluded from the next chapters. This loss was tangible not simply of place, but of influence and belonging. It was as though the threads that had connected me were being pulled taut and then snapped, leaving me adrift in a world that suddenly felt vast and uncharted. The neighborhood around me was unchanged, indifferent to the quiet exit I had made. Houses stood with their lights dimmed or off, windows reflecting the dusk as if unaware of the small drama that had just unfolded. People moved about in their routines, their lives continuing without pause. In that, there was a stark reminder. Life doesn't stop for personal upheaval. The world moves forward, indifferent to the upheavals and quiet departures that shape individual journeys. I found myself drawn toward a small park nearby, a place I had passed countless times but never truly noticed. The benches were empty, the trees casting long shadows as darkness crept in. Sitting down, I let the weight of the day settle over me. The silence around felt different here, less oppressive than the house, more like a blank canvas. It was a space where the noise of the past had faded, but the future was still undefined. A temporary pause between what had been and what might come. There was no dramatic revelation at that moment, no sudden clarity or breakthrough. Instead, the quiet offered a space to simply exist without the layers of expectations and unspoken demands. I realized then that leaving wasn't about escaping a place or people, but about stepping out of a narrative that no longer fit. The story I had been living was written in someone else's hand, and walking away meant reclaiming the pen, even if the pages ahead were blank and uncertain. The night grew colder, and the distant hum of the city began to rise, a reminder that life continued in its relentless rhythm. I remained seated for a while longer, letting the stillness wash over me, knowing that the days ahead would require navigation through unfamiliar terrain, both outside and within. The decision to leave had been made quietly, but its consequences would unfold in ways I had yet to comprehend. The shift was subtle at first, like a slow ripple across a calm lake that eventually distorts the entire surface. I noticed the absence before I noticed the change in tone. Messages that once arrived promptly, filled with casual inquiries or shared jokes, began to dwindle. When they came, the words felt clipped, cautious, as if the sender was weighing every letter before pressing send. Conversations that once flowed easily now stumbled over invisible barriers, leaving silences hanging heavier than words ever could. It wasn't just the absence of contact. It was the way people looked at me, the way their eyes held a question I wasn't prepared to answer. Rumors filled the spaces left by my silence. The narrative twisted into something unrecognizable to me, and soon I was cast in a role I never auditioned for, that of the one who had abandoned everything and everyone. It was no longer about needing time or space. It was about betrayal, about a failure to uphold unspoken responsibilities. People who once claimed to understand suddenly spoke as if they were experts on my intentions, my feelings, my character. Every unspoken word was reinterpreted as evidence, every absence as proof. I became a subject of speculation in conversations I wasn't part of. Names were whispered in hallways, opinions formed in my absence, and judgments passed without the courtesy of hearing my side. The weight of this silent condemnation was suffocating. It wasn't just the public misunderstanding. It was the personal fracture, the way those closest to me started to distance themselves, not out of malice, but out of certainty. Certainty that I had chosen to walk away, that I had decided to sever ties without care or explanation. Attempts to clarify were met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Explaining oneself can sometimes feel like shouting into a void when the people you speak to have already made up their minds. My words were filtered through their preconceived notions, twisted to fit the story they wanted to believe. The complexity of my reasons was reduced to a simple narrative. I was the guilty party, the one who left. It was a story easier to tell, easier to accept, than confronting the messy realities beneath. This reframing affected not only personal relationships but also my sense of self. When those who once expressed love and support begin to doubt your motives, it forces a reckoning with identity. I found myself questioning how much of what I was feeling was real and how much was shaped by the way others now saw me. It was as if my own reflection had fractured, shards of who I was scattered by the judgments imposed upon me. In the midst of this, I learned that silence can be dangerous, can be interpreted as guilt, as complicity. Choosing not to respond, to hold back, sometimes felt like the only way to preserve what little peace I had left, but it also became fertile ground for misunderstanding. The absence of explanation created a vacuum that was quickly filled with assumptions, and assumptions have a way of hardening into accusations. The world I had known shifted beneath my feet, and I was left navigating a landscape where the lines between truth and perception blurred. What was once a network of support became a minefield of suspicion. I moved through days marked by half-heard whispers and guarded conversations, where my presence was tolerated but my intentions questioned. The very people who once stood close now seemed distant, their warmth replaced by cold distance. This unraveling was not a single event but a gradual erosion of trust and connection. It was in the subtle shifts, the way messages went unanswered, the way phone calls ended abruptly, the way invitations ceased to come. It was in the quiet moments, alone with my thoughts, that the full weight of this transformation settled in. Not because of any grand confrontation or dramatic fallout, but because of the slow, steady withdrawal of those who had been part of my world. And yet, amid this growing isolation, there was an unexpected clarity. The story being told about me was no longer mine to control, but it revealed something fundamental about the fragile nature of relationships and the precariousness of trust. People's perceptions can change in an instant, and once altered, they can be difficult to restore. The narrative that had once been shared was now fractured, and I was left piecing together what remained, trying to understand how the version of myself that others believed in could diverge so sharply from the one I lived with every day. This divergence raised questions about identity and reality, about who we are when the lens of others distorts our image. It wasn't just about being misunderstood, it was about being redefined without consent, about being assigned roles that didn't fit, yet were difficult to shake off. The complexity of human relationships was laid bare in this process, revealing how quickly connection can turn into estrangement when communication falters and assumptions take hold. In this new reality, every interaction became a test, every word a potential misstep. The safety net of shared history and mutual understanding was gone, replaced by suspicion and distance. I found myself learning to navigate conversations carefully, to read between the lines, to measure silence as much as speech. The dynamics had shifted, and the rules were no longer clear. Trust, once freely given, had to be earned again, but the path to earning it was obscured by the very barriers that had formed. At the same time, I was becoming aware of the limitations of explanation and the futility of trying to control a narrative that was no longer mine. It was a humbling realization that, despite our efforts, the stories others tell about us are shaped as much by their fears and assumptions as by our actions. This recognition didn't bring comfort, but it offered a kind of understanding, a way to see the situation without the weight of frustration or denial. The days continued, marked by this uneasy tension between presence and absence, between what was said and what was left unsaid. My place in the world felt uncertain, a constant negotiation of boundaries and perceptions. It was clear that the story had turned, and I was living in the aftermath, watching as the narrative unfolded in directions I hadn't anticipated. Inside that house, the silence wasn't a pause. It was a force in itself, pressing down, thickening the air with every breath. Conversations were measured, words chosen with care because even the wrong intonation could ignite a subtle but palpable reaction. It wasn't about yelling or overt conflict. It was the undercurrent beneath every interaction that made the atmosphere suffocating. The walls seemed to absorb everything, every glance, every sigh, every hesitation, and then reflected it back, magnified and distorted. I learned quickly that nothing could be trusted to stay private. A whispered comment in the kitchen could resurface hours later as a weapon, a reminder that my words were never truly my own once spoken. The house operated on unspoken rules, a rigid framework no one bothered to define because the expectation was that you simply understood. There was an invisible line around acceptable behavior, but that line shifted depending on moods, alliances, or even the time of day. It created a constant state of uncertainty, like walking on a floor covered in thin ice. One wrong step, and the entire facade would crack open, leaving you vulnerable to scrutiny and blame. This game of careful navigation wasn't just exhausting, it was eroding any sense of self I had left. I became hyper-aware of my presence, constantly scanning for signs of approval or disapproval, adjusting my behavior as if on autopilot. Despite the tension, there were moments when the house seemed almost ordinary. The routine of daily tasks, the hum of appliances, the faint scent of meals being prepared. These fleeting fragments of normalcy made the contrast with the underlying unease even sharper. In those brief windows, I could almost forget the weight pressing down on me, almost convince myself that this was just another home like any other. But that illusion shattered quickly. The smallest misstep, a look held too long, a silence too deep, would pull me back into the reality of constant vigilance. I remember the nights best, when the quiet of the house was amplified by the dark, and the loneliness crept in alongside the shadows. Sleep was elusive, not just because of the noise in my mind, but because the house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen, though no one could say what. Those hours stretched endlessly, filled with the feeling that I was not just an occupant but a prisoner within those walls. The door was always closed, but it never felt secure. Outside seemed like a distant world, one I wasn't sure I could reach or wanted to. In trying to make sense of it all, I found myself questioning what was real and what was perception. Was the tension truly as thick as it felt, or was it the product of my own growing anxiety? The problem was that the house refused to offer any clarity. It blurred the lines between reality and fear, turning everyday interactions into minefields. I became adept at reading subtle cues, shifts in tone, a glance diverted, a hand tightening around a cup, and these became my survival tools. But they also tethered me more tightly to that suffocating environment, anchoring me in a place where freedom felt like a distant memory. The emotional pressure wasn't just a background noise. It was an active presence shaping every moment. It dictated how I moved, how I spoke, even how I thought. The house was a silent witness to the slow unraveling of my sense of safety, a place where vulnerability wasn't met with compassion but with suspicion. The absence of open conflict made it harder to explain to anyone outside, harder for them to grasp the reality I lived in. Without bruises or broken objects, the harm was invisible, yet deeply felt. I kept it all inside because there was no language for what I was experiencing. Attempts to describe the atmosphere, the feeling of being trapped without a cage, were met with confusion or disbelief. It was easier to wear a mask of normalcy than to invite questions that had no answers. And so, the silence grew heavier, the isolation more complete, until I wasn't sure where the house ended and I began. The boundaries blurred, and the story I lived inside those walls became a maze with no clear exit, only pathways that led deeper into the same relentless tension. The shift came subtly, unnoticed by most but unmistakable to the one who paid attention. It was during a casual conversation, something mundane that should have passed without incident. Yet the way I hesitated, the careful choice of words, caught their eye. There was no dramatic confrontation, no loud declarations, just a quiet, almost imperceptible change in the way I carried myself. They didn't press immediately. Instead, they observed. That observation was the first crack in the wall that had kept everything locked inside. It wasn't a matter of piecing together a grand revelation from a single moment, but recognizing the small inconsistencies that didn't fit the usual patterns. The way my laughter sounded forced, the way my eyes darted away when certain topics surfaced, the subtle tension that crept into my posture. All these were signs that something was off, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet. The person who noticed wasn't seeking drama. They were simply attentive enough to realize that beneath the surface of what I presented was a story left untold. This recognition changed something between us. There was a tacit understanding, a silent acknowledgement that what I was showing to the world was only a fragment of the truth. It didn't erase the isolation, nor did it immediately lift the weight of the unspoken, but it meant I wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time, someone outside the family saw the tension as more than just awkwardness or moodiness. They saw it as a signal, a plea for something beyond the usual interactions. In the days that followed, Their approach remained gentle, careful not to push too hard. Instead of demanding answers, they offered presence. Their questions were soft, tentative, allowing me space to decide how much to reveal. It was a balance between curiosity and respect, a dynamic that felt unfamiliar but strangely safe. The silence that had once swallowed me whole now had cracks where light filtered through, however faint. The truth, slow to emerge, began to take shape not in grand confessions but in small admissions. Moments when I let my guard down briefly, when the mask slipped just enough to show the strain beneath. These glimpses were enough for them to piece together fragments of a story I wasn't fully ready to tell. But that was no longer necessary. The presence of someone who simply noticed shifted the narrative from unspoken to possible, from hidden to hinted. This shift didn't erase the complexity of what lived inside the walls I inhabited. The maze of tension and uncertainty remained, still daunting and confusing. But now, there was a path that didn't lead deeper into silence but toward an opening, however narrow. I found myself looking at the boundaries differently, not as impenetrable barriers but as lines that might one day be crossed. It was not a moment of immediate relief or resolution, but a subtle turning point. The atmosphere changed imperceptibly, as if the air itself had thinned just enough to allow a breath where before there had only been suffocation. The maze was still there, but the map had started to reveal itself in faint, tentative strokes. From then on, the way I interacted with the world shifted in small ways. I was still cautious, still guarded, but there was a new undercurrent of possibility. The tension loosened, if only fractionally, and the silence began to fracture into fragments that could be spoken aloud. It was a slow process, marked by hesitation and uncertainty, but it was progress. The moment someone noticed wasn't an end but the beginning of a different kind of journey, one where the story inside those walls could start to unfold. The moment came unexpectedly, almost without warning. A small incident, seemingly insignificant to an outside observer, triggered a chain reaction that shattered the fragile facade everyone had maintained. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a loud revelation, but rather a quiet unraveling, subtle details slipping through cracks that had been too tightly sealed for too long. The patterns, once invisible or ignored, suddenly aligned in a way that made denial impossible. Those who had once dismissed my experience with offhand judgments found themselves confronted with evidence they could no longer overlook. At first, there was a stunned silence. The same silence that had been used to dismiss me, to question my credibility, now became a space pregnant with uncertainty. People who had been quick to form opinions without facts were forced to reconsider. The assumptions that had filled the gaps in their understanding began to unravel, replaced by questions that demanded real answers. This shift wasn't about vindication or triumph. It was about the unsettling realization that the narrative they had accepted was incomplete, perhaps even flawed. The exposure of these truths didn't erase the past or undo the damage that had been done. Instead, it complicated the story, introducing new layers that resisted simple explanations. Those who had insisted on silence as a means of control now found themselves struggling to maintain the image they had built. The protective walls of denial cracked, revealing the rawness beneath. Some recoiled, unable or unwilling to face the discomfort of what had been hidden. Others, caught off guard, scrambled to reframe their understanding, but the facts were difficult to dispute. In this shifting landscape, the dynamics between people changed. Conversations that were once avoided began to surface, though cautiously. The weight of unspoken truths pressed on everyone involved, creating a tension that was neither comfortable nor easily resolved. It was clear that the story was no longer contained. It had spilled out, demanding attention and reckoning. But the reckoning wasn't neat or conclusive. It was messy, fraught with resistance and hesitation. Amid this, I found myself navigating unfamiliar territory. The exposure of what had been kept private brought a new kind of scrutiny. I was no longer just the subject of whispered judgments, but also a reluctant catalyst for a broader reckoning. The experience was disorienting, as old roles and expectations shifted unexpectedly. Support and skepticism appeared in unpredictable places, complicating the path forward. The process of undoing years of silence was slow and uneven, marked by moments of progress and setbacks alike. The impact extended beyond personal interactions. The structures and systems that had allowed silence to persist were now under question. What had been overlooked or dismissed was now impossible to ignore. This shift did not guarantee immediate change, but it opened space for dialogue and examination that had been absent before. The truth's emergence exposed not only individual behaviors but also the broader context that had enabled them. It challenged the complacency and indifference that had allowed harmful patterns to continue unchecked. Still, the consequences of the long silence lingered. Relationships were strained, trust was fragile, and the emotional toll was significant. For many, including myself, the aftermath was a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. The truth's arrival was not a neat resolution but a disruption that forced everyone to confront uncomfortable realities. The damage, though illuminated, was not easily repaired. The journey forward required navigating the fallout with care, acknowledging the pain while searching for ways to move beyond it. As the layers continued to unfold, it became clear that the story was far from over. The moment when silence broke was not an endpoint but a shift in the narrative's trajectory. The truths that had been hidden now demanded attention, but how they would be integrated or resisted remained uncertain. The unfolding sequence of events hinted at further complexities yet to surface, as the consequences of exposure rippled through the lives and relationships involved. The room was heavy with unspoken words after the initial admission. Some faces showed relief, others confusion, but most were marked by a stillness that stretched longer than any of us expected. A few offered hesitant apologies, their voices low and uncertain, as if testing whether the ground beneath them might still give way. But those apologies felt distant, almost irrelevant, because what had been endured could not be undone by a few quiet sentences. In fact, the acknowledgement arrived too late to change the past. I noticed how some people avoided eye contact, as if seeing me fully now was a burden they weren't prepared to carry. The distance that had grown over time seemed to solidify rather than diminish, as if the gap wasn't just between us but within the very fabric of our interactions. It wasn't just about the truth being told, it was about how long it took for that truth to be heard and accepted. The delay had its own consequences, shaping the way I moved through the world and how others moved around me. There was a strange kind of stillness in the aftermath. No one knew quite how to respond beyond the initial admission, and the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace but one of tension. An invisible thread stretched taut between us, fragile and waiting to snap. The space between acknowledgement and action seemed endless, as though the truth had been delivered but the meaning had yet to settle. It lingered, hovering, a reminder that understanding is not instantaneous and that acceptance is rarely simple. I found myself reflecting less on what had been said and more on what remained unsaid. The conversations that never took place, the questions that were never asked, the moments when I had reached out only to be met with indifference or disbelief. Those were the unspoken stories that now weighed heavily on every interaction. The late validation was a quiet thing. No fanfare, no grand gestures, just a subtle shift in the way things were looked at, as if the world had slightly tilted but not enough to right itself completely. In the days that followed, I observed how the revelation rippled through the network of relationships. Some connections tightened, perhaps out of a newfound understanding or obligation, but many others frayed, worn thin by the strain of what had been hidden and the time it took to come to light. The unspoken undercurrents that had long been present became more visible, and the fragile alliances that once seemed stable now showed cracks. It was as if the truth, once released, refused to settle quietly and instead stirred up the sediment that had been allowed to accumulate. What struck me most was how little had actually changed in the practical sense. The validation hadn't altered the daily routines, the patterns of interaction, or the way people moved through their lives. It was a shift in perception, subtle and internal, but outwardly, the world continued with its usual rhythms. The past continued to exist as a shadow, a silent companion that influenced the present but remained untouchable. The acknowledgement was a kind of punctuation mark, a comma rather than a full stop, signaling that the story was far from over. There was an undeniable loneliness in that realization. To be believed, yes, but only after the fact, when the damage had been done and the isolation had taken root. The validation did not erase the nights spent wrestling with doubt, nor did it bridge the emotional distances that had widened over time. It was a quiet confirmation of survival, a recognition that what had been endured was real, but not necessarily a catalyst for change. It underscored the complexity of human experience, how truth can coexist with pain, and how acknowledgement can sometimes feel like a delayed echo rather than a source of relief. Even as the acknowledgement settled into the background, the challenge remained: what to do with this new reality? How to navigate relationships now that the foundation had shifted, even if just slightly? The answers were not immediate, and the path forward was uncertain. The late arrival of belief created a space that was neither fully open nor entirely closed. A liminal zone where possibilities lingered but clarity was elusive. It was a moment suspended between what had been lived and what was yet to come, carrying with it the weight of all that had passed and the quiet anticipation of what might unfold next. If you've stayed with me until here, it means this story resonated with you in some way. Maybe you've felt that same tension, the pull to hold on versus the courage it takes to walk away. And that's exactly why I keep sharing these stories. To remind us all that choosing ourselves isn't selfish, it's necessary. If that's something you've connected with, I'd love for you to join this space by hitting that subscribe button. Here, we keep exploring these moments that don't always get spoken about, but that shape who we become. And hey, if you made it all the way through, drop a quick comment with "Tacom Vose 80FIM" or whichever phrase feels right to you. It's a small way to say, yeah, I get it, I'm in this too. It helps create a little community where we know we're not alone in these hard choices. Plus, if this message landed for you, a like feels like a nod between friends who've shared something real. Before you go, there's a video right here that dives deeper into how those moments of leaving can actually open the door to something new, something unexpected but meaningful. So why not click and keep this conversation going? I'll be waiting for you on the other side.